Headquarters of common sense.
Talk Radio.
So 2 weeks ago, we talked about the World Economic Forum. We had a caller who said that he thought it was basically a conspiracy. Connor Tomlinson is here in the studio, I'm very glad to say, one of our regular contributors.
Peter.
Hello, Connor, how are you doing? Great to have you here. He's a political commentator with Young Voices UK. So, Connor, you know about the World Economic Forum. You know a lot more than I do. I did a lot more reading around it. It doesn't appear to be a particularly successful conspiracy, if it is a conspiracy, because everything's on their website.
Yeah, they're quite arrogant in that they sort of affront all of their bad ideas as their sort of selling point.
What is the World Economic Forum?
So it's a large international body. It's like a giant think tank, and a lot of people can think of it as a sort of cocktail party for the global elite, a lot of the politicians, etc. You remember when everyone was partying maskless at the G7?
Yes.
It's like a big version of that. They have an annual
sort of a bit like Davos then?
Yes, its headquarters is in Davos. So they're sort of a collection of special interest groups that set the itinerary for businesses, for governments. They advise policymakers, and they've got a lot of financial capital firms which invest in them and keep them all propped up, and they're headed by a gentleman named Klaus Schwab, who I believe his ideas are adopting a sort of tyranny. I'm not sure if he realises it, but a sort of tyranny because he grew up in Nazi Germany and he wants very much to be as far away from that as possible. So they're sort of obsessed with making businesses ethical in their parameters, and so they advise policymakers like in governments or at the heads of multinational corporations on how to conduct themselves supposedly ethically, sustainably, etc.
How powerful are they?
I would say they're very powerful just because they're setting the sort of tone with this thing called environmental, social and government scores. And that means it's the parameters by which a business has to organise themselves by. So this is why you hear...
Is this the Great Reset? Is that the same thing?
Well, kind of, yes. The Great Reset is... he wrote a book on this called COVID-19, The Great Reset, a couple of months into the pandemic. And much like, I believe it was Rahm Emanuel, who's a Obama's special advisor who once said never let good crisis go to waste, the idea that it's a conspiracy they engineered COVID is not true. But what they see is COVID is a massive crisis. This is the opportunity where we're adopting a new way of living. They call it the new normal, etc. So they see this as a way to make capitalism, in what they say. There's an article on the website that says, does capitalism need more Marxism, for example? And this is their idea to say, okay, here's how we can make our global financial system more equitable, more sustainable, more inclusive. So they're trying to moralise the market with COVID as an excuse.
So how do you moralise the market in their view?
So the environmental, social and government scores are a set of criteria that businesses have to abide by. So how many trees are you planting? How much of your business
so
is
you
running
don't invest in that business if it doesn't if it has a bad carbon footprint,
exactly.
or if they have private jets or
if
whatever.
they don't have a certain composition of their board being women or minorities.
Okay.
So the global financial capital firms which are backing the World Economic Forum and the governments which believe their ideas are good are going to give these businesses preferential treatment.
So some people would say, what's wrong with that?
Well, the problem is to track whether or not the scores are being met, and I've written on this in Town Hall, and Matthew Lesh from the formerly now at the IEA, he's written for this for Conservative Home. The problem is they need a digital infrastructure to track what you do related to interacting with their businesses, so then they can come back with their sort of shareholder reports, the stakeholder rather, because they call it stakeholder capitalism. So rather than delivering a profit for your shareholders, it's about people that benefit from the environment being clean or social equity, etc. Because they need metrics to report back to the World Economic Forum and say, hey, here we're hitting all our targets, let's get an investment. They need to gather data on you. And if you are an anomaly with that, if you're a dissenter, for example, if you don't like the ever-expanding acronym of LGBTAIQ, etc., or if you don't...
mark,
exactly,
exclamation mark,
Jumanji, LMNOP, yeah.
Jumanji.
So, or if you're not on board with net zero, which quite a few people, including me, and I'm a conservationist, is critical of that goal, then the businesses themselves might decide, hey, you can't shop with us anymore. And if those get to be essential businesses, like Amazon was, who are partnered with the World Economic Forum, and many businesses and governments are, during lockdown, many things were shut. Well, if you're deplatformed from Amazon because you're a political dissident, you've had your banking taken away, you can't use their...
So are we talking about individuals being sort of cancelled here and blacklisted?
Yes.
Has that happened?
That has happened from certain payment providers. It has happened for political dissidents from things like PayPal, and some of those people are very objectionable. Some of them are white nationalists. Obviously, we condemn that. But if you keep moving the needle, it's going to get very close to the balloon bursting. And you are right, because we've said net zero isn't a good idea, for example, certain various causes, because it might be very costly. Down the future, when the Overton window shifts, when more dissidents are decreed wrong thinkers, then will we be deplatformed from this? Have you heard about Rishi Sunak's initiative, for example, to do a digital currency with the G7?
Yes.
Yeah. So this is a sort of similar idea to what the WEF have proposed. This is why they've partnered with Coinbase, which is a cryptocurrency holding scheme. They're looking at things like digital technology in the future. They market it as sustainable because it's going to run all on renewables. You don't have to, spend money on trucks delivering fiat currency. They think it's really inclusive because more businesses do it. So there's a lot of ways to market this. The problem is, if they hold all the levers of power and you say something they don't like, they can turn off your thing overnight. And then, like in Latvia, we saw where people who weren't vaccinated couldn't go to grocery stores and they had to buy medicine and food through speakeasies. So that's a terrifying prospect, and we should be pushing back on that.
Interesting. We've got a text already from Robin who says, just heard a few minutes of Connor, but he is absolutely correct. This is an unelected body, but they clearly have a lot of influence on politicians. You've asked me to ask you, because I'm reading your tweet here about what we're going to talk about, but I am going to ask you, what is their role in the Ukrainian invasion?
Yes, well, I want to get this woman's name right. It's Daria Kalanick. So the woman who recently asked Boris Johnson about instituting a no-fly zone in Poland. Everyone was calling her a Ukrainian journalist. She's actually the head of an anti-corruption organisation, and she was backed and went on the World Economic Forum's Young Global Leadership Programme. It's basically like a summer camp for the up-and-coming group of world leaders who are going to be appointed to governments. Emmanuel Macron was part of it, Justin Trudeau, Angela Merkel, and it's basically telling world leaders what kind of ideas you really should be doing in the next generation, what issues are going to be faced. But it's clear that people so high-profile as this journalist, and she's been given airtime on British networks, etc., lauded by the press without much of an examination of her background, well, if this person is endorsing a policy which would push us possibly close to nuclear war, a no-fly zone on Russia would be seen as an act of aggression by NATO. It's quite scary of, one, what is the WEF endorsing its acolytes, as it were? What ideas is it putting into their head? And should we really be allowing this unelected body to put people in
be blamed
such...
for what one person says? I mean, if they're a collection of... They would probably argue, we're a collection of ideas, people come together to exchange ideas and so on. But your view is they have a very clear orthodoxy, and if you dissent from that orthodoxy, well, then you're in trouble.
Well, yes, Vladimir Putin was also part of the Young Global Leaders thing, and they just deleted his account from their website. Now, that might be seen as, obviously, a lot of other places, even like FIFA football, have taken off Russia from their game. So it might be seen as, we don't associate with the Russians anymore. But it seems like he's dissented from the orthodoxy of a lot of the world leaders from different parties, like Trudeau, like Biden, like Boris, all who are meant to have different persuasions, like liberal versus conservative. But they're all using the same slogan, Build Back Better. That was from the World Economic Forum's 2019 conference. So it seems like they're putting forward this idea. If you're on board with the idea, you get high positions of power. If you're not on board with the idea, you're digitally cancelled. And that means crazy people like Putin might be able to weather the storm of annoying the international elite, but me and you, if we've got digital bank accounts and they don't like what we've said, where do we buy our shopping?
But has that happened lots? I mean, has that really happened to people like you and me? I mean, if you're cancelling the use of PayPal by a white nationalist, extremist, racist, to be honest, I'm fairly happy with that. But I mean, your view is that it's a sort of mission creep. I mean, what's your evidence to say that will definitely happen?
It's not to say it would definitely happen, but in terms of
it's just saying that it could happen.
Yes, and the concern is when Rishi Sunak says, for example, we're going to have a digital infrastructure alongside cash. Fine, I'm happy to use a possible digital infrastructure for convenience. The problem is if that becomes the only way to pay. Australia and the Netherlands have gotten rid of their cash points recently, by the way. If that becomes the only way we can pay is a digital system that the government has their finger on, then isn't that a scary precedent for basically any political dissident, especially if the parties change hands, for example, if Labour comes in, and if you dissent from any of their opinions, boom, you're gone overnight. So I think we should be on the watch for this sort of policy. Okay,
I think it's not a bad thing to watch, but I also think you're probably going quite far in terms of what might happen. I mean, what would you say to people that actually you're just a bit paranoid about it?
I would say elect politicians who do not seem to be parroting the buzzwords of the World Economic Forum policy. We're already seeing our net zero sort of collapsing, and again, I'm a conservationist. I think I would hope renewables and especially nuclear would come up in the interim, but they're not there yet, so we need gas. So that's sort of put it as a pipe dream, nips it in the bud. But if you're seeing people talk about equity, so equal outcomes for different groups, if you're seeing people talk about diversity and inclusion across all of society, stakeholder capitalism, build back better, be very sceptical as to whether or not your politicians are just saying the popular talking points at the moment, or if they've bought into these bad ideas from an unelected body who, I mean, it wasn't long ago that we voted to be out of the EU. I don't see why we should treat the World Economic Forum as any different than the EU.
Than the EU?
Yes, because they're unelected, they wield a lot of influence, and we can't say whether or not the politicians we've elected are under the sway of their bad ideas or whether or not they're going to do what there is in their manifesto promises.
Thanks, Connor. Well, that's Angela, who was in touch previously, says, I'm even more scared of the World Economic Forum after this, after Connor's explanation there. So thank you very much indeed for coming in there, Connor Tomlinson, political commentator with Young Voices UK. And it's happened in Canada apparently. Freezing bank accounts, that has happened, of people who are who are the part of the sorry?
The truckers.
The truckers,
Yes.
exactly. Sorry, I'm brain fade there. Nodley Bennett style brain fade there. David Richards has been in touch as well on the point that Stephen was making earlier. Hi Pete, women going out to work is the biggest reason for marriage breakdowns. Expands the market and temptation, doesn't it? That's one point, I suppose. David, thank you very much indeed for that, and thank you to Connor as well.
Good talk.
Hot talk. Bold talk. Talk radio.
Listen on your smart speaker.
Watch it live on your smart TV.
The world headquarters of common sense.
Talk Radio.